We'd be honored if our elder Hayden Melton-Tallow would help us with opening words. Hayden is from the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika Nation. He's been involved in social work for much of his career and is also an elder in residence at Bishop's University. And we had the great privilege of working with Hayden on the assessment as well. Hayden, it would be my honor if you would open our good words.
Okay, it's connection with you physically. It's one to go that you keep with. So you can do. And then my just book I just was. Good evening, welcome to White Museum for this. Well, I haven't seen the book. I haven't read it either. I don't know if they took my good set of the photographs, but I'm looking forward to looking at the book. And I don't like to, at this moment, talk about land acknowledgement because in our neck of the woods, the Indian community, indigenous community, it's becoming very divisive. There's three groups of thinking. One is that we don't do land acknowledgement. It's very divisive amongst our tribes. And they don't want us to have land acknowledgement because they want to show the diversity of all nations across Canada. And the third one is, it's not designed by Indigenous community. It's designed by government. And I don't know if that's done by design but it's there. It's creating a lot of, in my back of the woods, that kind of confusion, But on here, those things are for politicians. I'd rather not talk about politics. And I'm here to welcome everybody because of the assessment being done. The Canadian Mountain Association did an assessment. All the Indigenous people that live within the mountain regions. Blackfoot people don't live in the mountainous region, but they do depend on the contributaries that come from the mountains. And we rely on, say for example, vision quests. We go to a Castle Mountain here, it's part of our land, where we get our teepee poles. Because they're the most straightest part there, we can get them. And just west of there, that's where we get our ochre, red, blue, and yellow colors. Now they call it paint pots. And of course, not Okiskun, which is Banff now they call it. But us we call it not Okiskun, and this Holy Springs. And those are the areas, only certain plants grow there for medicinal purposes and ceremonial purposes. And if you look, when you come into Banff to the gates, when you look towards Banff, in the meadow, you could see a buffalo, sitting there. If you go up right now, you could see the head of the buffalo. That's another sign it's our territory for us, Blackfoot people. And Lake Minnewaca, another area. And that's just, it's not just here, but all along the eastern slopes of the Rockies. We depend on what's coming out of it through hunting and, like I said, vision question, stuff like that. So I'm glad that Canadian Mountain Association did this assessment. To me, they're giving voices to the people that live there. Because a lot of times they overlook the indigenous communities that do live there. And there's a lot of development there that contradicts the way they think. I cannot speak for the mountain people, because it's not my job. It's not my position to talk about them. But I support them, personally, what they're doing. And I think the Canadian Mountain Association did as a milestone, coming up with this book, looking at a different perspective, how we treat the mountains and the people that live there. And I can't begin to describe what's going on in there, because there's qualified people that live there to talk about those things. But anyway, don't laugh at my photos if there's some in there. And welcome.
My name is Molly, and I'm the manager of community engagement and public programs here at the White. On behalf of our staff and in collaboration with the Banff Centre Mountain Film and Book Festival, I want to thank you for being here tonight. We're thrilled to be hosting the Canadian Mountain Assessment book launch and reception. The White Museum serves as a gathering place to engage with the evolving histories, people, environment, and ideas of mountain culture. And for that reason, it's a great privilege to serve as the gathering space for this conversation tonight. Please be aware that this event is being recorded and photographs are being taken throughout the night. We will be using this material for marketing purposes, as well as to share this conversation with an international audience. Should you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to me or you can reach out to Katie, wave your hand, who will be taking photos tonight. The washrooms are located at the front entrance to the right of the visitor services desk. And I hope, as many of you saw, there is tons of food out there, so at the break, please make sure you get some. At the end of this panel discussion, we will be transitioning into the reception portion of the evening, and we kindly ask that you pick up the chair that you're sitting on and head down the hall. White Museum staff will be there to stack all of the chairs so that this can become a usable space. There will be a cash bar that's opening at 7:30ish, where you can purchase alcohol and some drinks. We encourage you to roam the galleries this evening. All of them are open. Please check it out and enjoy your night. And please join me in welcoming Greg.
Good evening, everybody. Wonderful to be here. I just want to note at the beginning we have some open seats available if anyone would like to come in from the sidelines. There is room. Welcome. Gabrielle, nice to see you. Thank you, Elder in Melting Tallow, for your good words and welcoming us to this place, and other elders in the room who have helped us to open our event in a good way. Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you also to the White Museum and Molly Riley, Don Sundersdahl, Don Livingston for allowing us to host this event at the White Museum. There's really no better place we could do this, so thank you so much for that. And thank you also to the Banff Centre and the Banff Festival for inviting us to be part of the festival this year. It's such a treat to be able to share this work in the context of such a significant festival. And thanks to all of you. I know there's a lot of great things going on in Banff this week, so thank you for spending your evening with us. So we're here to talk about the launch of the Canadian Mountain Assessment. The Canadian Mountain Assessment is the first formal assessment of what we know, don't know, and need to know about mountains in this country. But uniquely, it's also an effort to do that in ways to draw on both Western academic and Indigenous ways of knowing to enhance our collective understanding of mountains. So the book that we're here to discuss tonight represents, I think, two things, and I just want to call this to your attention at the outset. It represents a product, a physical book, a place where we can come to learn, but it also represents a process by which many of us in this room and others across this country came together to try to think about mountains and our relationships with one another in new ways. And so I hope that you'll keep that in mind as we talk about the work tonight. This work was made possible by funding from the Canadian Mountain Network, and I know several folks from the network in the room. Thank you. We're also supported by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada and are grateful for that support. And likewise, the University of Calgary provided important institutional support to help us run this program. So we're grateful for all of that support, which enabled us to do this work. So the CMA, as I'll refer to it, is the outcome of over 3.5 years of work and a tremendous amount of care and attention and effort amongst an extensive and diverse group of people from across this country. And for me, it has been truly humbling and truly a privilege to be able to learn from and with this group of people. So as Molly alluded to tonight, I'll give a short presentation and then we'll hear some brief reflections from one of our international advisors. We'll have a short break where you're welcome to grab some appetizers and chat with friends. And then we'll have a panel discussion with several of the members of our project that are with us tonight. A reception will follow, and I think at that time, please find appetizers, and if you'd like to grab something from the open bar, do so. But more so, take that time to talk with one another, and particularly the many people from the project that are in the room tonight. So we're here to launch a book, and I want to just acknowledge that assessments are a unique kind of book, and maybe not the kind of book that many of us are used to engaging with. So what are these assessments and why are they important? Major assessment initiatives emerge sort of around the early 90s with things substantively like the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And more recently, we've seen a few mountain-focused assessment initiatives. So these are large book-length reports that are prepared by extensive groups of authors who come together from a variety of different expertise and geographies to do sort of three things. Firstly, to raise awareness of a particular topic of interest. Secondly, to characterize the state of knowledge relative to that topic. And thirdly, to track progress in addressing any needs or opportunities that are identified in prior assessments. And here we can look to the model that's commonly employed where assessments are conducted at set intervals across time. I'd like to add that there's a fourth layer that's salient here, and particularly in the context of this work, and that is the role that large assessments play in building communities of practice around bringing people together who have shared interests but might not have previously had a chance to work closely together. So it's important to note that existing assessments are almost exclusively based on scientific knowledge. And to date, substantive engagement with other ways of knowing, particularly indigenous ways of knowing, have been relatively limited. Importantly, and I think in ways that we can all appreciate, that's beginning to change, and we'll hear one of our international advisors speak to that in the context of the IPCC later. So these assessments are incredibly important for shaping public understanding, for steering funding, and for bringing people together to advance work on topics such as mountains, but they're also a tremendous amount of work. So why would we have bothered to do something like this for mountains in Canada? Canada is a country of mountains. Canada is, it turns out, the fourth most mountainous country in the world by area. Here's a fact for you. You could fit the entirety of Switzerland within the mountainous area of Canada 54 times. So mountains are a very prominent feature of our physical geography. But the size of the country and the extensiveness of our mountains means that they are also places that represent very high geological and biological diversity. And indeed, we have some of the most intact large mountain ecosystems on the planet. The one that we sit in today is a great example, the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor. And these unique details and specificities of mountain geology and ecology also underpin and inform a variety of biocultural connections and interdependencies with mountain places in the country. So mountains have been homelands for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples since time immemorial. And accordingly, many indigenous territories and linguistic regions are associated with mountain areas. And these mountain areas have sustained, but also been stewarded by indigenous peoples who continue to know and care for them. Likewise, and more recently, non-indigenous people have come to live in mountains across the country and have lives and livelihoods that are deeply interwoven with the specificities of mountain areas. Let's look at some numbers. Today, 1.3 million people live within the mountain areas of the country, but if we add a 100-kilometer buffer to that area, which is commonly done for things like coasts and other types of geological features, 82% of the population of this country lives within or adjacent to mountains. That's globally unique, and it indicates that mountains are, again, an important part of our sociocultural fabric in this country. Mountains, too, bring much that we value and appreciate, and that draws us into relationships with mountains, what we in the mountain assessment call gifts of the mountains. These are things like fresh water, which is important for those who live in the mountains, but those far downstream, for foods and medicines, for recreational activities, for inspiration for arts and cultures. Look at the Banff Center. It's a great manifestation of that idea. They're also sites of spiritual significance and places of solace and meaning. But these places are changing rapidly through processes of environmental and social change. Many of us are aware of the processes that are initiated by climate change, impacts on ice and snow and glaciers, changes that causes in mountain hazards, but also resource extraction is changing land use and land cover, fragmenting ecosystems. We're seeing invasive species and the accumulation of pollution in mountain areas. We've also seen settler colonialism deeply disrupt the relationships that people have with mountain areas across this country. Historical and contemporary changes in mountain economies are affecting mountain areas. Land management regimes have differentiated implications for people across this country. And growing pressures from tourism and recreation are also changing mountain areas. So these pressures are working cumulatively to rapidly transform mountain environments, mountain homelands, and the gifts that mountains provide, with consequences that are not yet well understood. Despite all of this, there's never been an effort to make a formal assessment of what we know, don't know, and need to know about mountains in the country. Now, this has severely constrained our ability to articulate the importance of these places, and in a convincing way, to then garner support for the kinds of research and actions that are needed to navigate the challenges and opportunities facing mountain areas in this country. It also means that the specificities of mountains in Canada are not well reflected in global discourses around mountains in places like the IPCC or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But this lack of an assessment does not mean that there's a lack of knowledge. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples have nuanced, holistic, and sophisticated knowledges of mountain systems across the country, which have been cultivated through close connections to mountains across countless generations, and which are passed down intergenerationally through oral knowledges that are often located in place-specific protocols. Likewise, there's an extensive body of academic research that is focused on mountains in Canada and that provides detailed assessments of things like mountain hydrology, ecology, and tourism economies. So the CMA then endeavored to bring forward the first formal assessment of these diverse knowledges. So to do the assessment differently and to do it in a way that draws on and values the diversity of these knowledges. And in so doing, we aim to elevate our collective understanding of mountains in this country. So how did we do this? We started by thinking about how a project like this might be governed, and we conceptualized this as a stewardship circle. This is meant to be a less hierarchical governance approach. And here from the outset, we drew in people from a variety of geographical, cultural, and academic backgrounds and worked collaboratively to define the spirit and intent of this work, to think about the project's conceptual and ethical underpinnings, and the kinds of work and content that would also be included in the assessment. We also together shaped what an assessment like this might look like in terms of its structure. So this was a highly intentional process from the outset. It's one that certainly elicited moments of difficulty, not least of which because we were doing much of this through Zoom. But it also stimulated deep reflection and creativity, and indeed, I think, some important innovations. Overall, we had about 80 core contributors involved in this work. 1/3 of those contributors were First Nations, Métis, or Inuit individuals, which we were incredibly grateful to learn from and with, many of whom are in the room tonight. Not pictured on this map are the 28 external reviewers, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people that took time to read earlier versions of this assessment and to provide constructive feedback and help us shape the work and put it forward in the world in a way that was accurate and consistent. This work also came up with 5 guiding principles. And these principles, I think, are so important for understanding the nature of the work that we've done that I'm just going to ask you to bear with me while I read through them. The first guiding principle of the Canadian Mountain Assessment is related to service, where the CMA is guided by service to mountains and mountain-connected communities, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and non-human, now and into the future. Our second principle is related to inclusivity, where the CMA celebrates the diversity, depth, and specificity of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, as well as Western academic ways of knowing. And we aspire to demonstrate the breadth of these knowledges, as well as points of synergy, tension, and emergence. Our third principle is related to humility, where we aspire to collaboratively advance a good effort, acknowledging that our assessment about mountains is inherently reflective of structural disparities, of procedural limitations, and our own positionality. Fourthly, the CMA is committed to upholding the integrity of diverse knowledges that have been shared into this project, respecting the privacy of culturally protected knowledges, enacting ongoing consent, and ensuring open access, publication, traceability, and transparency in our work. And lastly, our final principle is around action, where we aim to enhance understanding of the importance of mountains and to stimulate research, relationships, and actions that support the realization of desirable mountain futures. To begin doing this work, we started thinking about how we would come together from so many different ways of knowing to produce an assessment. And we thought that Indigenous and Western academic knowledge systems both provided different expressions of valid and useful knowledge. But importantly, we would have no attempt to integrate these knowledges into one unified truth. We wanted them to stand on their own terms. So the goal was to bring different knowledge systems into respectful dialogue to enhance collective understanding, to work towards what some have called knowledge braiding. So the journey of knowledge co-production or knowledge braiding is akin to climbing a mountain in the context of our work. We use this as a bit of a heuristic, where the higher we climb, the more we learn, the greater trust we build, and the more we have a collective enhancement of our understanding. The thing about this is that we did not stand on this summit, and I don't think we would want to make that claim. But I think what we can claim is that we have started to put in a good path that we hope others will follow and push higher into the future. Our goal with the academic literature that was available was to exhaustively assess that. And to do that, we conducted a formal systematic review where we identified nearly 3,000 articles that talked about mountain systems in this country. So as I said earlier, there's a lot of knowledge out there across multiple ways of knowing. We then classified that literature according to where each study was conducted, what it focused on, what its key findings were, and how the work spoke to mountains. We then were able to share that massive bibliography with the authors who were involved, and they were able to draw on that work to speak to the Western academic knowledge. We also conducted numerous foundational analyses related to mountains where there were gaps in our basic understanding. This includes things like the first comprehensive assessment of observed and projected climate impacts across mountain areas of the country, issues related to land use and land cover change, mapping the distribution of mountain weather stations, and things like demographic trends in mountain areas. Jayao Gao, who's in the room with us, did incredible work on many of these, as well as other authors in the room. So we also tried to fill some of those knowledge gaps through our own efforts. With respect to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit knowledges, our explicit goal was not to try to assess that exhaustively. Of course, that would be impossible. Instead, we wanted to show some of the diversity, the depth, and the specificity of Indigenous knowledges. Specifically here, focusing on the idea of trying to lift up oral knowledge sharing traditions, which are central for many Indigenous peoples in this country. So what we did is we convened what we called a learning circle here in Banff, and we came together over 3 days with 20 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit individuals, chief, many elders, youth, to talk about the issues and the stories that come from the mountain homelands of those individuals. So the idea was to provide a respectful and more culturally appropriate space for sharing oral knowledges about mountains. Importantly, during this gathering, we left a chair open as a sign of respect for the knowledge and aspirations of non-human kin who reside in mountain areas. With contributors' permissions, a videographer who was experienced in knowledge co-creation with Indigenous peoples recorded the knowledges that were shared in that space. And following extensive review by participants, we were able to share knowledges that were deemed publicly appropriate to share publicly in the assessment, and I'll speak to how we did that later. After this, we had an author workshop where Indigenous and non-Indigenous authors came together to try to figure out what this would actually look like on the page of something that is a material document. So how this knowledge co-creation would look in practice. And again, there was no blueprint for what this might look like. So between early 22 and mid 23, we were involved with putting Hayden's picture on the screen. We were involved with preparing, reviewing, and revising chapters. So an important innovation of this work is that each chapter is led by an author team, but that chapter team is co-led by an Indigenous and non-Indigenous person. And contributing authors are also Indigenous and non-Indigenous individuals. So we were working collaboratively in the actual design, but also assessment process itself. So with respect to review, I mentioned that earlier, we had an internal and external review process, so there was a short amount of time where we shared chapters amongst ourselves and provided feedback. But then we actually shared this work out with, again, 28 external reviewers. We received nearly 800 comments in return to really, really, in a meaningful way, helped us shape our work, and we have tremendous amount of gratitude for the time of the reviewers that took time out of their lives to speak to this work. To make revisions based on those reviews, we brought in chapter review editors, and they were involved with each chapter team to help authors engage appropriately and thoroughly with those review feedback. And I know Pearl-Ann is in the room, and perhaps other editors. So how did it actually come together on the page? I've pulled a few pieces here. I've spoken about the authorship model, and you can see how that's reflected in the chapter there. The chapter, of course, includes an extensive amount of text, which assesses primarily the academic literature. There are also maps and figures, tables and artistic works and photographs that really help to enrich and animate the assessment. But significantly, there is access to the recordings of oral knowledges that have been shared by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit individuals. And so I just invite you to keep your eye out in the assessment for this symbol with 3 mountains and these QR codes, which will actually, when scanned, bring you to the conversation with that person and the knowledges that they share. Now, we might start that clip in a part that's relevant to the topic being discussed in the chapter, but the whole conversation is available to you so that that knowledge is not taken out of context. Another important innovation here is our efforts to honor ongoing consent. So we have worked with our publisher, the University of Calgary Press, to make it possible for contributors to request the removal of any stories or knowledges that might be deemed inappropriate to share into the future. That withdrawal can happen quickly online and will be reflected in any future print runs. So together we feel that we have a document that has rich and engaging content that weaves together these different ways of knowing. Certainly it's not perfect. We are all here learning together how to do this. But I think that we do see the pages of the CMA really reflect the spirit and intent that I've discussed at the beginning. I want to dwell for a moment on the significance of the Indigenous knowledges and oral knowledges that have been shared into this assessment. You could pick this book up and you could read through it, and you could miss a tremendous amount of knowledge. And so I just want to encourage each of you to really spend time with the stories that have been shared into this space. They're tremendous and reflect an immense amount of knowledge and an immense amount of care across generations to bring those knowledges forward. So preparing the assessment has been a 3.5-year-long journey. It's had lots of twists and turns, but I think all of us are stronger and have been more enriched by the process. It's been a remarkable journey to undertake together. In the end, I'm really proud of the group that has stayed the course to bring us here to this moment in Banff. Thank you all. This just showed up 5 minutes ago. What we have tonight to share with you is the Canadian Mountain Assessment. The full title is the Canadian Mountain Assessment, Walking Together to Enhance Understanding of Mountains in Canada. Now, this is a book-length assessment report. It's composed of 6 chapters, and it speaks to some of those issues that I've discussed earlier around environments and homelands and gifts and pressures. But we have a concluding chapter that also reflects carefully and critically on the process that we embarked upon together and charts a course forward for how we might move towards more desirable mountain futures. The book provides a foundational contribution to our understanding of mountains in this country, one that is based on multiple ways of knowing. It also embodies a unique and at times profound process for advancing applied knowledge co-creation efforts in a large-scale assessment context. But it would be remiss of me to say that this has been done in a way that provides an exhaustive assessment or that we have perfected a co-creation process. Indeed, the opposite is true. The CMA is a beginning. It's a point of departure. It's an inflection point, if you will, and one that we hope others will be inspired to build upon and take forward. So we have been tremendously privileged to work with the University of Calgary Press to bring this book forward in a way that speaks to our aspirations. The book is published in 3 forms. We have the physical copy, which is available here tonight up front. We have also online versions that are free and accessible to anyone. There's a PDF that you can read online or download. And we have a third option where the videos are actually embedded in the text, so you can just go through and actually play those videos as you're reading. So I hope that you will engage with one or more of those options and enjoy this work. Before we go to break, I want to share a short statement from Dr. Carolina Adler. She is the Executive Director of the Mountain Research Initiative in Bern, Switzerland. She's also a member of our International Advisory Committee and was the lead author of the IPCC's recent Mountain Focus chapter. She's going to speak about the IPCC's emerging efforts to begin including Indigenous knowledges, as well as what the CMA contributes to advancing applied knowledge co-creation efforts in a large assessment context.
Hello, my name is Carolina Adler. I am the Executive Director at the Mountain Research Initiative, which is a global research coordination network supported by the Swiss Academy of Sciences, and that for over 20 years has been dedicated to connecting and interrelating global change research in mountain regions worldwide. One of the many activities that we as a network engage in is in synthesizing, connecting, and interrelating research outcomes from a wide range of scientific disciplines in order to provide comprehensive and systems-based inputs that are useful to global assessments, such as those conducted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. In the recently concluded 6th assessment cycle of the IPCC, we had the unique opportunity to once again elevate mountains in the IPCC assessment focus through dedicated chapters and analytical outputs that report on the state of climate change in mountain regions, including its widespread impacts and adaptation measures to address these changes. For the first time in this 6th assessment, the Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate, SROC, which was adopted by the panel in 2019, contained a comprehensive assessment of Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge holders' recommendations for utilizing this knowledge in assessment reports, which draws on the analogy of weaving strands of knowledge inputs that together create a rich tapestry of knowledge that offers a much deeper understanding of the challenges and the opportunities that come from adapting to climate change. The assessment cited various examples of cases and research activities that engage in co-production with various knowledge holders, including in mountains. Indeed, we are seeing an increase in amounts of studies that are delving deeper into this type of more transdisciplinary approach. And the assessment itself made recommendations for how a framework could be elaborated for taking better account of Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge in future IPCC reports. The IPCC experience for me was an example of the increase in recognition given to Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, and how it absolutely demonstrates that it contributes to enriching the evidence base that we rely on for awareness, learning, planning, management, and taking decisions. Despite this recognition, it is still not fully practiced, least of all as part of an assessment effort and in specific contexts such as mountains. And so this is why the Canadian Mountain Assessment, CMA, is so special and groundbreaking, because not only was the entire journey co-designed, both in terms of process and content, but the content itself was also co-produced with all relevant knowledge holders actively engaged. We therefore have much to learn from this unique experience, and we certainly look forward to seeing how we may help share this wisdom going forwards. For me personally, it has been a real honour and privilege to be part of the International Advisory Committee of the CMA. It has been very gratifying to see this whole project and process evolve and flourish, and of course learn from it. I would like to congratulate all the CMA team and all authors involved in this outstanding effort, which makes a huge contribution, not just in providing a comprehensive assessment on the state of global change in Canadian mountains, but also in contributing with methodological advances that really help us leap forwards in our efforts to engage in more inclusive and representative knowledge for decisions and actions. Congratulations to all involved, and I wish you all the best for the event that we are enjoying these days. And we certainly look forward to staying in contact to continue the journey of learning. Thank you.
So thank you for your attention to the opening remarks tonight. It's really a treat to be able to share the work we've done with you, and I hope this has whet your appetite a bit. We are going to take a 10-minute break. We have wonderful appetizers available. Please help yourself. And after we return, we will have a panel discussion where we hear from a variety of members of this project. So we'll see you back here at 5:55. Thank you. All right, we are going to now have a panel discussion where we will have the opportunity to learn from a variety of folks who were involved in this project. The event is going to be moderated by Dr. Madison Stevens. Now, Maddie is our project assistant, which is a title that completely doesn't suit the scope of work that she's contributed and the intellectual contributions that she's made to this project. So we're in good hands with Maddie the whole way through and here tonight, so thank you, Maddie, for doing that. Maddie is not only the project assistant for this project, but also a postdoctoral fellow at Boise State University, where she's working on issues related to bison with the Blackfoot Confederacy. We have many esteemed panelists tonight, including Elder Gudea Mary Jane Johnson, just to my left. Gudea is an advisor and also an author on this project. She's an elder from Huane First Nation up in Yukon. Next to her is Kiara Lightning. Kiara is a lead author. She's a member of Samson Cree First Nation, and she's a master's student at University of Alberta. Next to her is Professor Sean Marshall, who is an advisor, an author on the assessment. He's a professor of geography at the University of Calgary, and also has served in a tremendous way as the Departmental Science Advisor for Environment and Climate Change Canada. Next to him is Dr. Joe Shea, another lead author. He's an associate professor of geography at the University of Northern British Columbia. And here's Danny Inkpen, lead author, assistant professor of history at Mount Allison University. And last but certainly not least is Megan Dicker, who's also a lead author. Megan is an Inuk woman from Nainu Natsiavut, and she's also studying at Carleton University. So with that, I will hand it over to Maddie, and please enjoy this event that we expect to go until around the hour, and then we'll hope to have a bit of time for questions and answers before we take our reception. Thank you.
Thanks everyone so much. I have to admit that it's quite surreal to be here. It's been an incredible journey with this group of colleagues, and many more of whom are out here in the audience. So it's incredible to be here, and I'm really excited to be able to have a conversation with you all about what this project has meant and some of the key kind of ideas that have come out of it. So I want to start with Elder Gudea. As Graham has mentioned, one of the things that the CMA has really tried to do is to respectfully bring together multiple ways of knowing in ways that uphold the integrity of those knowledge systems, but also really bring them into conversation with each other to enrich our understanding. So, and this is something that, Gudea, you've been a guide for us in this process from the beginning. So I want to ask you to reflect on what does this mean for you, and why is this important?
Tante, Gudea Uye, one man Jay. I came from that little brick spot in the Yukon. And I forgot about this. Then Jay, Gadia Uye, Juan Man Ninjay. I came from that little red spot on the map in the Yukon Territory, so the western part of Canada, some of the highest mountains in this country. I want to draw attention to our chair here. This chair is for our relations, all of our relations that are not here physically with us, but we made space for them in our panel, as we did in many of our discussions. Bringing ceremony and words of guidance into how everyone came together based on different forms of knowledge of what mountain assessments are, allowed for a more comprehensive and holistic presentation of mountains as homelands, as ecosystems, and the challenges they face. People grounded in ancestral knowledge, local knowledges, scientific research, and data-driven analysis all contributed their unique perspectives and insights. This multi-generational, multidisciplinary, multicultural approach took work to become an inclusive process for carrying out this mountain assessment in Canada. It also ensures that the diverse needs and perspective of both local communities and broader stakeholders were considered, while always keeping in mind doing work in a good way to give solid grounding for the youth today and the 7 generations ahead of us. So,
Thank you. Thank you so much. Joe, so the first kind of substantive chapter of the CMA is on mountain environments. And this is an area you're deeply knowledgeable about yourself, and I assume had the opportunity to learn from quite a wide range of other perspectives on. And so you co-led this chapter with Dr. Daniel Sims. And I'm really interested to hear more about what were some of the lessons that came from this chapter in terms of what we know and don't know about mountains. And what are some of the things that surprised you?
I guess maybe one of the first things is that I'm not an expert. I realized in writing this chapter that there's a lot that I don't know personally. There's a lot that we don't know. And I think, one of the biggest surprises for me was just appreciating these other perspectives that are out there, right? And I come at this from, the Western scientific tradition. We propose theories and we do experiments and we collect data. But there's a whole other way of seeing the world and the mountains. And I think for me, that was the biggest thing. A lot of that is really difficult to capture in a written chapter. And so I think that's the other main lesson here is that, local knowledge is really critical to understanding these environments. And I think there's a huge opportunity to improve the way we do science and incorporating that knowledge into the projects that we work on or the collaborations we build. That's a really important piece.
And what do you see as kind of the key gaps that emerged from your chapter?
Well, okay, so if I put on the scientist hat, which we always need more data, right? We're always talking about more studies or funding for studies, or we need this, we need that. I remember sitting with Daniel Sims, he's my co-author, he's from the University of British Columbia as well. And we were having coffee one day talking about the chapter, and I said, Daniel, I think this is one of the things, we just don't have enough data. We don't know anything about these mountains, the blank spots. And he kind of looked at me for a second and paused, and he said, well, maybe you don't know anything about those mountains. And I was like, ooh, that's a really good point. So I think that came out in the chapter, and I hope it did, that, there's knowledge out there, but maybe I don't have it, or the scientists don't have it scientifically, but there's a there's a huge body of accumulated knowledge from, generations of experience on the land that I think is really important to bring into these assessments.
That really gets at this principle of humility that I think was so deeply impressed upon all of us in this process of just the scope of what we don't know as individuals, or many of us at least. So the next substantive chapter was mountains as homelands, and the two of you at the end there, Danny and Megan, you two co-led that chapter. And I remember in early discussions about this chapter, one of the salient points, and I know others here were involved in this as well, but one of the really important points was to think about distinguishing mountains as homes from mountains as homelands. Could you talk about what is significant about this distinction, and maybe share an example or insight that represents how mountains are acting as homes or homelands? And I'll leave it to you to decide who to start.
Hi, I'm Megan from Northern Labrador, and I'll be speaking to mountains as homelands. Viewing mountains as homelands emphasizes the integral need for respect and preservation of the mountains and the relationships that exist between people, animals, spirits, and the mountains, and all of those relations within those. There's a deep connection to culture, to identity, and to history that we share based on our relation to the mountains, and there's a deep love that guides everything, in my opinion, because we love the land, we take care of the land, and obviously if you're going to love something, you're going to take care of it, so in doing so we take care of mountains as our homelands.
Thank you, Megan. I should note that I think that the framing of this distinction of mountains as homes versus homelands is owed to Elder Gudiana Mary Jane, who was part of this project long before either Megan or I came along. And Megan spoke really beautifully about what we mean by homelands when we wrote in this chapter. When we wrote about homes with a little h, homelands had a big H, we were looking at the literatures on ways that non-Indigenous folks of various kinds have come to be at home in mountain places, for short or for longer term. So we ended up looking at literatures on mountain artists, on guides, on recreationalists of various kinds, queer communities, racialized non-Indigenous communities, laborers of all kinds, early European settlers, military personnel, a huge set of literatures, really. And what we were concerned with was trying to understand how these diverse groups of people, through practices and stories and representations, came to feel at home in mountains, and importantly, how those stories and representations and practices can generate certain kinds of ideas about what mountains are and maybe what they're for. So to give an example, we're here in what's now called Banff National Park, but we know from Elder Hayden Meltingtowel and from our knowledge of the space in general that it wasn't always called Banff National Park, that it's homelands to a host of Indigenous peoples. And so then the question is, when the Dominion government and CP Rail decide to make this national park, they start doing all kinds of different things here. What did that mean for who was welcome in this space, who was not as welcome? What kinds of practices were encouraged and what were forbidden? And what does that mean for how we today understand this place that we're sitting in now? So that's the sort of thing that we were thinking about and looking at in this chapter when we were thinking about homelands and homes. And I think that the distinction was so fundamental for us, and it comes down in some ways to a very basic truth, which is every geographical space that we considered in our chapter, all of the different kinds of homes that were made on those spaces were always made on someone's homelands. And those people are still there. And so I think sometimes it's hard to sit with that kind of complexity, but in our chapter we were we were determined to not oversimplify this and to live with that complexity and try to honor it.
I think you both did a beautiful job of doing that, along with the co-authors on that chapter. It's really extraordinary to the way in which you address that complexity and those distinctions. And I think that chapter segued really beautifully into the following, which is about gifts of the mountains. And this is, I think, where I see one of the really important differences in the CMA from a lot of other types of assessment activities is in the framing of gifts. And so I remember really vividly at the Learning Circle event, the conversation about gifts took on this really incredible richness and life that was actually quite different than the previous sessions that we had up to that point. And it felt like gifts were such a salient, meaningful way of thinking about mountains. And so I want to turn this one to Kira first, and to talk to us about what does it mean to think about these as gifts as opposed to, say, ecosystem services, a different version of framing what we receive from the mountains.
I'm just testing this. Okay. I think that is one of the greatest changes in the way that we framed the conversation, and yeah, it had a huge difference in the Learning Circle, I think, than if you were to gather people and ask them to talk about the ecosystem services of the mountains, but that it let the people present to talk about both their personal experiences of what their relationship to mountains has been, whether that's gathering medicines or doing ceremony, or connecting with family, having gatherings, or the resources that are brought, like fresh water, or economy, as well as the long-standing, like the stories that come from the mountains and the ways that people have derived their identity from mountains, and the family stories that are passed down about people and where they've traveled and where they've been, that give these places their names, and that provides so much to culture, and that goes so much larger than just ecosystem services. And it also, just talking about the gifts of the mountains brings us to talk about what do those gifts then, what responsibilities does that give to us when we are given these gifts without an expectation of giving anything back, but it does give us a responsibility to honor those gifts and to take care of them and to conduct ourselves in a way in which those gifts can continue to exist. So just the act of framing it as gifts brings about thinking about this with reciprocity and with our actions.
Thank you. That's beautifully stated. Gudya, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on this relationship between gifts and responsibilities and what that means in the context of the gifts of the mountains.
That goes back to homelands. And as I was driving on the highway coming this way toward further toward the west on the Trans-Canada, I was happy to see that the crossing that is on the highway for the animals, to make use of that crossing. I know that there are other nations in North America that use that kind of thinking of land connection in regards to the dissecting of homelands. Road ecology is a big thing in my book someplace. But for all of the relations that are using that walkway that is here on that highway, thank you, because that keeps them connected on their homelands as well. Maddie said you only got 5 minutes.
No, take your time.
So I have to write everything down. Honest to goodness, I'm gonna tell you stories all night. Gifts mean something presented to another in appreciation, from love, to be kind, or as part of celebration. In our way, the way that I was raised up in Dunquin-Jay and in the northern part of this land, over in the bottom of the St. Elias Mountains, When we have a one-year memorial for a person who has passed away, a memorial potlatch, we have that for someone who has passed. The family, the clan, the community come together to give gifts. And the citizens of the opposite clan who has supported the family since the passing are called out and witnessed receiving gifts in recognition, appreciation, and thanks. This gift giving and receiving strengthens family, the community, and relations between nations. Thou is mountain and our way, gives gifts to nourish us and all of our relations. It also provides for a catch for atmospheric moisture to bring water to the lives of all that live in the lower communities. How we care for land and waters in our lifetime is how the mountains will continue to provide for the youth of today and for the 7 generations ahead. Kako.
I think when in the conversations that we had throughout the course of this project, I know every author team who's spoken so far really wrestled with how to disentangle what they were talking about from the pressures facing those systems. It was very, very difficult to think about mountains as homelands, to think about mountains environments or the gifts without thinking of the ways in which they're rapidly changing and how we might address those changes. Joe and Sean were both directly involved in the Mountains Under Pressure chapter. Sorry. Sean, I may turn to you first. This chapter really draws on these previous 3 to think about the changes in mountain systems. Can you speak to some of the specific pressures which you feel are most kind of important or particular to mountain areas?
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. And it's really true. I was going to comment on that as well. I remember at the Banff Learning Circle discussions when we were talking about mountain environments, and the floor was open for narratives and what we're experiencing from different parts of the country. All we talked about was change, how mountain environments are threatened and how they're changing, and that also applies to the gifts of the mountains and mountains as homelands. So it's hard to, you're right, it's very hard to separate those things, but within those, it's easy to think about, most of you here will be from the Bow Valley, and it's easy to think about the pressures here, which are really real, and they're like that in many mountain communities in the US and Europe where you have climate change, but perhaps the greatest pressure is population pressure and tourism and people and development and resource extraction, and all these things are squeezing habitat and wildlife corridors, and I think some of what came out in the Mountains Under Pressure chapter was kind of some of the compounding effects of all those different pressures. And I think also that we don't think about or deal with those very well. We have, at least within the Western science literature that we've talked about, we focus on and measure one aspect of the system, but we don't often bring it together very well in the more holistic world view that multiple ways of knowing and Indigenous knowledges can bring to us. So listening to those stories that these things are all connected and they're all part of the same story, it's different than how we write our papers. And so I think going forward, I'm jumping ahead a question or two, I think, but going forward, we really need to be thinking about how we better integrate that knowledge, and that came clear as we tried to write the Mountains Under Pressure chapter, that these don't exist on their own. And you can think of, maybe last point on that, hear from Joe, I think there's a lot of research, a lot of people living here, and we can picture and see those pressures here, but as Graham mentioned, Canada is a huge country, a very mountainous country, and there are massive areas where we don't have a lot of data, a lot of studies, a lot of knowledge that's published. There's knowledge out there, but it's hard to scan the literature and understand what's happening, but those pressures are everywhere, and it's kind of a question of, if the tree falls in the forest, if there's no one documenting it, but here it's maybe more like if the tree burns, or if the glacier's melting and no one's measuring it. All these things are happening all across the country, and it's, as you go up the mountain, there's mountain biodiversity in Canada is not the same as in the tropics. It's not like the biodiversity hotspots for the country, but there are very unique special species and niches and refuges that only live in our mountains, and as things warm and as we develop up the mountain slope, these species are getting squeezed out and they come off the top and they've got nowhere to go. So that's happening across the country, whether it's from land use change or development pressures, or whether it's from climate change. And I think that came out clearly in the Mountains Under Pressure chapter, that we need to think of more holistic ways to measure and monitor and understand what's happening and bring together all the narratives we can, because Western science on its own isn't enough there.
Thank you. I think that speaks really well to the other part of the question I wanted to ask, which is really around, what does bringing this understanding of these different pressures into the same space offer for trying to address them, and what do you feel like we need to know? Feel free to elaborate on the other question as well, but what do we need to know here in order to address these pressures?
That's a very tough question to answer, Maddie.
Sorry, Joe.
Thanks. What do we need to know to address those? I mean, obviously we want to know as much as possible, right? But again, I think it's this holistic viewpoint that we often miss. We don't often consider other perspectives when we're trying to address these problems. And I think that is really critical. And I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to make it happen going forward. It's a big challenge to do, but really bringing in other voices and other viewpoints on, the systems that are there in place, the human pressures and these other physical pressures like climate change that Sean mentioned, and also bringing in, whatever technological advancements we can do. And I think for me, one of the surprising things in the Mountains Under Pressure chapter was this map that we put together. We used someone's data set. They looked at glacier change, every single glacier in Canada, how much it's changed in the last 20 years. The map is a great show of hands. Well, I don't know if I can do a show of hands here.
Go for it.
Do you think there's a place that is responding more to climate change in terms of glaciers than others? If you think so, raise your hand. Okay. Yeah, you're right, except they're all negative across Canada. It's a stunning map if you look at it. And there's a couple hot spots, we would call them, where things are receding more rapidly, like glaciers on the eastern slopes here in the Rockies. But glaciers in the Arctic Cordillera are responding the same way as glaciers in the southern coast mountains, the same way glaciers in the Torngads. It's a uniform picture. And for me, that was it really brought home one of these pressures, which is global in scope. And that sort of, viewpoint is coloring everything that we look at going forward and how we adapt to these changes.
Thank you so much. I think that's really interesting to think about. And there's a lot in the CMA that brought out the diversity of these different places, but there were also some really important shared pressures and also shared gifts. So I think that really emphasizes that point. I want to ask another question on pressures, which I might bring up if I have time, but I think I'll segue first. I have time? All right. Kara, do you mind if I throw you a bit of a curveball here? One of the things that came up in the Learning Circle really strongly, that we talked about quite a lot in talking about pressures, was access. And for Indigenous peoples, the way in which the compounding effects of many different changes related to colonialism have shaped access to mountains. And I wonder if you'd be comfortable speaking to some of those insights. Feel free to hand it off.
I was actually thinking about that as you guys were talking about pressures, is that I think one of the great experiences for me working on this project was like the openness to have these conversations where we're not limited to maybe what most academic experiences to me are or would want to talk about with pressures, but that we can expand. Like if we, like in the learning circles, if as Native people we're talking, then the whole conversation is shaped by colonialism. And if we're talking about the pressures that are on our ecosystems, our communities, on anything, it's all within the effects of colonialism, and none of the pressures are separate from that. They all kind of are coming out of colonialism, and in a non-native space, people don't always see it that way because they aren't experiencing it that way. And I think within this assessment that was a conversation that we were able to have, that the learning circles were able, the learning circles were able to shape that conversation that we had within the assessment and the way we wrote about pressures, and that like echoes through all of the chapters. And Megan, do you want to talk to this more?
I was thinking about accessibility also, but in the sense that in Northern Labrador, like the Torngat, it's pronounced Dunguk, just a fun tip. Dunguk, it's okay. A lot of people, it's a spelling, but it's pronounced Dunguk. Anyway, the mountains are hours away from our communities because my grandparents and a lot of other Inuit were relocated or displaced by the government to more southern communities, which is where I'm from now. But the point being is that the mountains are hours away, so it's super hard to even get there. And it's why I feel like I have an interesting relationship with mountains as homelands, because they're not necessarily my homelands, but they mean so much to me that it doesn't feel like a distinction, like it's just part of who I am and my family and my family's history. But with colonialism too, it's super hard to get to the mountains because gas is so expensive, and it's hard if you don't have a skidoo or a boat to get there in the first place. And we do have a base camp there, but it's thousands of dollars for just 1 week to stay. So it's obviously catered for certain types of people, most people who are white and from just random places. But it feels really weird because there's a lot of people who die before they get to go home because it's so inaccessible. There are programs that allow community members to get back, but even then it's a small percentage of who should be going back to the mountains.
Thank you both for so graciously speaking to that, especially when it was a question out of the blue. I really appreciate the eloquent responses to that question. I think this turns well to the last chapter of the CMA, which was about desirable mountain futures. And I think this chapter kind of evolved in a way that we didn't necessarily expect from the beginning. And it emerged out of a workshop that we had just a year ago. I was corrected, I thought it was like 2 years ago. It's been a long year. But we had a conversation on Zoom, and that was really profound in reflecting on the process and thinking about what were core ideas that could shape desirable mountain futures. And Kiara and Dr. Eric Higgs co-led that chapter. So I'll hand it back to Kiara again to start with that. And then Sean was also quite involved with that process. Others here were also in the conversation. So if you could start, I'd love to hear kind of what you think are some of these key features of desirable mountain futures. What came out in that process?
I was thinking part of writing the futures chapter, I feel like, was balancing contradictions. And maybe I'll bring it back to the access thing, because we have a section of the last chapter talking about access. And one of the contradictions that came up in that was how people talked about the importance of their experiences in mountains for the spiritual connection that they have to these places and the value that they place on them, to inspiring action for people to protect these areas, that it's important to have these experiences of how powerful they are in order to inspire that action, as well as considering the damage that access is doing, that the damage of so much development and tourism and human access to these spaces is at the same time part of what is damaging those places. And I don't think we have a solution to that, but a lot of that last chapter is considering these conversations and these contradictions so that we can discuss them and to understand that sometimes we don't have a way to we don't have a tidy way to reconcile these contradictions and these messy issues, but that was one of the things that came up in that chapter.
Thanks. I'd like to hand it to Sean as well to talk about kind of a similar question around what are some of the features of desirable mountain futures, but also to think about how do we mobilize those insights. And I know you work in the policy space. Are there opportunities for these insights to come out in that context?
So these are big questions, Maddie. I really like how Desirable Mountain Futures came together, so thank you for that. And it kind of represented the whole project to me that, I guess as a scientist working in the mountains for many years, I have, my own ideas about how things are changing and how we're documenting that and how we're bearing witness to that. And I think most people here in the room probably can bear witness to that and have your own stories, your own connections to the mountains. And I think that this project goes partway towards what we need for the vision for Desirable Mountain Futures in terms of building that connection and doing this in some national way that's been lacking. And Graham mentioned this in the introduction. We've never had an assessment like this before. We've actually never pulled together the Canadian mountain community before, and that did this with scholars and people at universities, but it went way further and pulled together communities and people from many, many, many different nations across Canada, and that this was amazing to be part of that journey, I guess. And that we need more of that. So in terms of Desirable Mountain Future, this is, as Graham said, the beginning, and we need to further that and advance that and build on these connections. And you can see it, I think, and hear it in the presentations, the kind of diverse group that's been brought together and the new ways of thinking about things. And I would say that Canada considers itself an Arctic nation very strongly, but it doesn't consider itself a mountain country. I spent the past few years in Ottawa, as Graham mentioned, working with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Ottawa is far from the mountains. I miss them a lot, but people in Ottawa don't think about the mountains. If you're living in Switzerland or Nepal, you're in a mountain country, and there's resources and coordination, and a lot of thinking goes into that. It's part of the identity, and it's part of our identity here, but that's not true as a nation, and I think we need to promote this assessment and build on that to get a little bit more understanding of and integration of mountains and how we do things. And maybe just a final point on the Desirable Mountain Futures. I mentioned already the more holistic view of things, and I say that as somebody that's worked just in glaciology, kind of measuring and modeling glacier melting and doing work with Joe and really enjoying it, but it's such a small piece of the whole picture of how things are changing. And within this assessment, we engaged in the natural sciences like that, but also really with the multiple ways of knowing that includes a lot of different avenues within social sciences, which are so important to this and are, I think, understudied, certainly not there in the literature, the way the natural sciences are represented in the literature on mountains and mountain changes within Canada, and I think it's probably true globally. But again, as all of you will know, the part of why we're here and why we care about this is the cultural and spiritual value that we all get from the mountains by spending time in the mountains. And when you're a scientist, you're not supposed to talk about that. You're not supposed to be attached to what you're studying or be emotionally moved by what you're studying. You're supposed to be very distant and kind of cold about it. As a glaciologist. But I think this project allowed us to go beyond that and think a bit more about why we really value, so not just the data and the observations and the models and projections of what's happening, but actually building in what our people, our collaborators, our partners in this project have been telling us forever, that it's about values, and then from the values comes caring and understanding and nurturing and advancing a sustainable future for the mountains. That's, I guess, the big message for me.
I totally agree, and I think it brings me back to the workshop and also the learning circle and author meeting. It was incredibly emotional experiences, really. It was really beautiful, I think, in a context of something like this, to be able to lean into that and kind of appreciate that we all have a lot of connection here, and these are powerful, moving things. I want to turn next to, so if we think about the future, we can't also help but think about what it means to bring youth voices into the room. And we had the privilege of working with many really amazing emerging scholars and young people in this project, including Megan and Kara. And I actually want to turn this one to Megan and Danny, because I think Danny and you worked together on that chapter, and I wanted to ask you both about that experience and kind of maybe turn to Megan first to reflect on why it's important to have youth involved in these activities, and also what was the process like? What was enabling or challenging?
In terms of youth being part of processes like this, we are the ones who will inherit and continue to advocate for the land. We're already doing that, and we will continue to do that. And it's important for us to be a part of this process because we offer new ideas, innovative ways to employ sustainable development. I feel like my generation, we don't have, actually that's not right. I feel like my generation, we're just not gonna take what was handed to us anymore. So I think it's important for us to be part of any process because we could revise or completely throw out and create new policies and new ways of doing things. I often think of my community, and in the last week we had two funerals for 2 young women who died by suicide. So when I think of youth being part of processes, I want to get involved and I want to do whatever I can in any space to make our communities more supportive and more relevant to us, and to just show that that I'm doing things and that there's so many other people who are doing things to ensure that it's not going to stay like this and that we're not just going to watch it happen. So it's really important for me as a youth, but just youth in general, to be part of these things, because otherwise there's huge gaps and it's just only going to get bigger otherwise. So yeah.
Bless you, Maddie, for including me in the youth question. I might be an emerging scholar, but I am not a youth.
I was actually going to call you in your established scholar role. So.
I did think a lot about young people, though, in this process, and part of the reason that I did was an early conversation that I had on the phone with Elder Goody and Mary Jane, who made me see this project differently. I was a new mom and when I came on board, and she said something to me that really resonated at the time, which was that the product is secondary, the process is primary, and you can think about this as trying to raise your child. You try to do your best, and you focus on the process, and that really resonated. And so then when I was in my role as co-lead, I understood my job to be, in part, to try to help lift up and elevate folks like Megan who need to be heard, and also to try to be aware of the various things that are going on in their lives. They're not in tenure track, paying jobs, and maybe don't have all the stability that they need. So trying to be alive to, okay, what do you need from me right now was a big part of how I understood my job, and I think I will leave it there, actually.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I think it was incredible to be a part of this team. It was quite nurturing, and that was in large part because we had really those of us, I include myself in this category as an earlier career scholar, we had really incredible mentors, and that was it made it quite an enriching experience. I want to turn to Elder Didia for the last question. I might open it up if we have time, but you've been involved in this since the beginning, Sean as well. Can you reflect on this journey, how far we've come and where we started from, and really also to think about how far there is still to go in this process.
When we first began with that phone call from Graham, and we had other elders on board, and things didn't go very smoothly, but it was dedication. It was a belief that something could come out at the end that would be useful, and also that the work that you do today is also for the children tomorrow. In our way, part of our statement of land claims in the Yukon Territory in 1972, we said, together today for our children tomorrow. And I believe those words are really how we need to continue each day of our life. I really strongly feel the work from the Truth and Reconciliation, the calls to action. I try to make sure that I gear all of my life energies in work-wise toward uplifting the 94 calls to action, because I am part of this generation that is going to make a difference. So my participation was to make sure that we move ahead, and we move ahead with good stories. How do we bring stories into this kind of an assessment? How do we bring song? How do we bring art into assessment? It was, again, process, and the great work of David Borish, to be able to, that you could hear the voices of Hayden, of Gabrielle, of Kara and Megan. You can hear those voices in the recordings, in the online one. What we learned, we have learned to undertake an assessment of this scope, that it takes clear vision, strong administrative support, support from the Indigenous peoples who will be integral to the outcome, long-term financial commitment, and flexibility to try different paths, as some may fade out or be permanently blockaded. We learned this assessment is only a start, and by the time the next assessment is conducted, there will be much stronger Indigenous textual documentation to the 3,000 that Graham mentioned. And also, with the way that this assessment has been laid out, as Carolina Adler said, that it is groundbreaking because we've moved beyond just a document of words. We've moved into storytelling as part of being the documentation, as art as being the documentation. And that to me is good work. Clermont.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for sharing your insights and good words, and also for sharing so many insights over the last few years. I wanted to ask if you're comfortable for the other authors and contributors who are in the room, if you could stand up. It would be great to see who all is here. Thank you all. It's been a real privilege to work with each of you, so I appreciate you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. Thank you all so much for sharing your experience. It's, I think it's probably clear for everyone in the room what a tremendous and moving experience this has been for all of us. I think we have time for a couple of questions that we can do in the audience, and then I'll provide a brief closing before we go to reception. Is there any questions from the audience? And I think, Molly, do you have a mic? Okay, great. Kate has a microphone. Any questions, please? And perhaps you can let us know who.
I'm interested in your concept of 7 generations that are coming. How did you get onto that number of 7 generations we're preparing for?
That mic. I usually been in the halls and there's only one mic and 2,000 people get passed around. 7 generation is a concept that has been within the First Nation, Inuit, Métis, and Indigenous global community for decades. In my lifetime, I've been blessed to know 5 generations of grandmas, mums and grandmas, and my grandchildren have also been blessed for the 5 generations. That's 100 years easily. 7 generations, you're looking at the time frame of what is 100 to 150 years. Looking at 7 generations of the circle of teaching, of the 7 teachings. You're also looking at life that is the work we do today is always for our children tomorrow. And I know that when I was talking to Danny there, that yes, we can get caught up in the end product, but when your children are raised, they're on their own. They're the decision makers. They will be decision makers. Young people today that are in their 20s, in 10 to 20 years' time, they will be the decision makers. So you're always thinking, making sure that you let the young ones have the best trail, the best knowledge, so that when it comes time for them to go out on their own, they can follow that trail and come back home safely and tell you good stories.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to give the mic back to Megan. She still had an answer about the next generation. I wanted to make sure she was able to speak still.
Okay, thank you. Now, I was just thinking about the challenges that you asked, and for me, it was a personal thing. It didn't have anything to do with anyone here, but I was thinking like I'm just one person with like one voice, my own experiences, and I was like, I don't know if I can like, just write. I felt weird just doing that, but then I thought everything that I know has been taught to me from so many other people, so I like to keep that in mind that even if like you're just one person or if I'm just one person, we're a collection of everybody that we know and that loves us enough to teach us things, so I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Megan. I believe Corey has a question too.
Hi. I don't really have a question. I just, I'm just so moved by what you all said. And I thought this was just going to be a damn academic talk. And I just came because I live down the street from Graham, and
Little did you know what you were in for.
I'm just so moved by what you said. And being a singer-songwriter, wanting to pass on more stories. I'm surrounded in this beautiful building by my great-aunt Pearl Brewster's vest over there, my great-uncle Jim Brewster here, and I was born in this town, and my dad was born in this town, and my grandfather was born in this town, and my son grew up in this town. So the work you've done has really inspired me to keep telling the stories as authentic and honest and truthful as I can. So thank you very much.
I think you can take one more question if you like, and then we'll close out.
Thank you. This one's going to be for Megan. Just kind of talking about youth, and then this document kind of setting the track for more Canadian mountain assessments. What were some of the challenges in this kind of blending of academic and other knowledge systems, and how do you think this document's going to kind of move this new form of knowledge forwards?
In terms of this document, I think just having like an Indigenous and non-Indigenous author for each chapter is a big thing, but then like the many voices are strewn throughout the book, throughout the assessment, so it's good. But in general, I think about this a lot because I'm often asked actually about like Western knowledge versus traditional knowledge, or Western science versus Indigenous science, and it's, to be honest, it's kind of annoying because like Indigenous knowledge is science, and then it's just a weird distinction in my opinion. So I think if we think about that a bit differently, we can just, I think it would be more appropriate or more understandable to just talk about the different ways we acquire those knowledge rather than like dividing them into different types of knowledge.
Thank you, Megan. Please join me in thanking our panelists. So before we break for the reception, which you've seen the folks on the stage and folks in the room who are here and would be happy to continue speaking with you, I just want to again acknowledge the White Museum for the real privilege of launching this book here. As I said at the beginning, there was nowhere better to do it, so thank you. And Molly, thank you so much for the work you've done to organize this event. It's been done beautifully. Thank you, Molly Riley. Oh, please.
Just to, I'll let everyone get out to the bar and to the remaining food out there, but I would be remiss not to give a huge thank you to Graham for really pulling this all together. This was really Graham's vision, Graham's project, Graham reminding us about deadlines on most days. And I'm honestly, I've been in this business for a long time, but I've never been involved in a project like this. And your comments were very apt, because when we all met after a year or two of Zoom, when we all met at the Banff Learning Circle, it was the only meeting I've ever been at where everyone was crying at some point in the meeting. It was really quite a wonderful experience.
Thank you, Sean. I really appreciate it. So I'm feeling quite moved by that. Thank you, Sean. Sean's a hero of mine, so I really appreciate that. Just also want to thank Don Sundersdahl here at the museum, who has really helped us bring this event together. Don. Joanna Croston and Lori Harvey at the Banff Center and with the festival have helped bring us here today, have helped give us a place to sleep in Banff and to share this event out. So thank you to the festival and to the Banff Center for helping us do this work. The Canadian Mountain Network provided those resources that were necessary to do this work, and I want to acknowledge and thank the network. We have several members in the room. Thank you for that support. It's been tremendous. Likewise, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada has very much helped this work get to the point it's at. And the University of Calgary has really been our institutional home, and I thank you at the university for hosting this and helping us bring this work into the world. The University of Calgary Press has been our publisher. They have been tremendous. I don't think we could speak more highly of them. The director, Brian Shivner, Helen Hinjowski, Allison Cobra, who brought the books here tonight, and Garrett Marcoot are amazing. And thank you for everything that you've done. The press, it's been brilliant to have the book here on time. I mean, literally the book, like landed that you got it. Yeah. To the CMA contributors, you all have enriched my life in ways I couldn't have imagined at the beginning of this, and I want to thank each of you for coming to this work with open hearts and open minds, and for staying the course together. We've done hard work together, and we're much better for it. Thank you all, and I so look forward to carrying this work forward with you. I want to particularly call attention to Maddie Stevens and Sean Marshall, who have been so instrumental in this work, and aside from their prodigious intellectual contributions, have really made the operations of this work. You know, I think about a year and a half in, Sean started to see me go blue in the face from overworking, and Maddie came on board and really helped us carry this work forward, and really played a tremendous role in helping us host in particular that learning circle in a good way. And so Maddie and Sean, you know, you have just been such a mentor to me, and have helped me through this process to learn how to run a project of this size, and to be inspired to carry it forward, seeing the tradition of mountain work that you've brought into this country. So thanks particularly to both of you for your roles in this project. I really am honored to have worked with you. I want to thank you for your attention as I go through these acknowledgements. I know it's long, but I'll keep it as brief as possible. I want to acknowledge those in this country, those in this room, who create and who hold knowledge of mountains. This work wouldn't have been possible without you. So we don't have everyone in this country involved, but this work wouldn't have been possible without all of those people. So I just want to acknowledge those people who gave us a foundation to draw on to do this work, for the generations that India has spoken up and have helped us be in a position to share these stories. I want to also thank my wife, Vanessa Kist, and our little one, Rika, who's drawing, I think. The support and understanding and encouragement that you've provided has been exceptional, and this work would not be possible without the families behind us. And so for me personally, I want to thank you, Vanessa, for all that you've done to help guide me to this place and to be supportive of the work that has taken so much time and effort. Thank you very much for that. And finally, to the attendees, again, an honor to be able to share this work with you. Corey, I'm glad that we disrupted your expectations in a way that I think has been generative. I hope that's true for others. I'm going to conclude tonight with a short passage from our final chapter. Thinking about the assessment as a baseline focuses attention on the product of the knowledge, and less on the process by which it came about. While always intending to present multiple ways of knowing mountains, few participants were prepared for how profound this exchange of knowledges would be and what it would spark. Working in this space was new terrain for many of us who contributed to the assessment, and it has been a learning journey for all involved. As with many significant journeys, the final outcome was often uncertain. As Elder Gadea remarked, sometimes when we undertake hard work, we want to see the end result. We want to get it done. But sometimes it doesn't happen quickly. We have to pass it along to the next generation, like a good story. Our hope is that what we have prepared will inspire new research, relationships, and actions that help us secure desirable futures for mountains in Canada and beyond. The story is yours to carry forward. So go get the book. It's out here in the lobby. It's available to you here. Please enjoy it, learn from it, be inspired by it, and please do carry this work forward. Thanks so much, and enjoy the reception.